Now, anyone for meat grown in a laboratory? Think about it for a minute. Doesn't sound too appetising, does it? Well, it is the future, according to my next guest, Professor Brian Ford. He's an independent research biologist. He's written about what he considers the attractions of cultured meat in a new book of essays, in a book called Death and Anti-Death. Bit of a yuck factor, isn't there?
Well, you'd think so. But look at the tremendous success of things like corn that everybody buys. Corn is a cultured laboratory-based fungus protein. It's totally unnatural, completely synthetic, wholly based on science, and is enormously popular with the health food lobby. And it isn't so much a question of thinking to oneself, well, perhaps we just move over to laboratory-grown or factory-grown beef. It is that we simply cannot possibly afford to go on raising cattle in the future, as we have in the past.
Why?
Simply because the costs are too high. When you get a kilogram of beef from the shop, it's probably taken a ton of water to produce it. And water is a finite resource, and it's a resource that we're fast running out of. I mean, up until the present time, Winifred, we've actually had enough food to feed everybody. When there have been famines in the past, like that terrible famine in Ethiopia, for example, that Michael Burke so memorably reported on, it wasn't actually due to a lack of food. Ethiopia at the time was a net exporter of grain and still importing luxury goods like Scotch whisky. It was a lack of political goodwill. They simply wouldn't allow the relief trucks into the area. That was the problem. We have not been short of food, but the world's population now is just about being fed, but is set enormously to increase. And when that happens, growing meat in the future, as we have done in the past, simply won't make sense.
Well, there are people who would argue with you about that, but let's let that go for the moment. You've talked about... I haven't made a note of their names, but I'm sure there'll be thousands of them. They'll all be emailing us. If we wanted to do it, you've mentioned corn, which, as you say, is an artificial protein which is produced using fungus. But if we wanted to actually grow real meat, but grow it in the laboratory, could we do it now? Is the science there?
Well, it's actually harder than most of the scientists think, and that's very true. The Dutch, in 2007, ploughed €2 million into research in Utrecht and Amsterdam. But the only time I've actually spoken to people who have eaten the product were Americans, and they actually were cultivating, in artificial circumstances, the tissues from a goldfish. Now, I don't know anybody who's... Sardines, yes, but they're silver. I don't know anybody who's eaten a goldfish, but goldfish meat has so far been produced artificially, and they said it tasted very nice. Doesn't appeal to me too much. But, I mean, I look at things differently to the way that most people do. When I see a piece of beef, I see a great culture of striated muscle cells. Now, those muscle cells, it doesn't really matter whether they grew inside a hapless bullock that is then going to be painfully slaughtered, or whether they happen to be growing inside a large tank in a factory. It isn't materially different, and it certainly isn't as spooky and as unacceptable as I think people at first sight might tend to think.
But the answer to the question, is the science ready? Not yet.
No, indeed. Very nearly, though.
People like you who make these points in the past are usually told, aren't they, that without animals reared for meat, the landscape just would be unrecognisable, because it's sheep and cows, isn't it, that have given us our rolling fields. Are they right? Are they right?
That's what I often find myself saying to the scientists who say, just think, it would be wonderful. We could actually get all the meat that we want and never have to kill another animal. Think how humane it would be. But in fact, the whole of the European countryside and the prairies of America, they only existed because of the grazing of animals. And anybody who thinks that producing cultured meat is simply going to lead to the banishment of animals and the end of animal slaughter is in fairyland. I mean, without grazing animals, then we wouldn't have the British landscape. So this is certainly no recipe for saying that we could do away with farm animals altogether. So it is a way of saying that we could actually make a guaranteed standard of meat in large amounts, very much cheaper and less cruelly than currently we do. Slaughtering animals is always cruel, and raising animals for beef at the end of the day is always cruel, no matter how you look at it.
When are we going to be doing this then, the cultured meat thing? Predict.
Well, I don't know when, although there is actually a $1 million prize in America that's been put out by PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And they have said that if people can produce an artificial form of chicken that is on sale in 6 states of America, they will give the first person to do it a $1 million prize. And you know as well as I do, Winifred, that the lure of a prize is the very kind of thing to tempt American entrepreneurs to pull out all the stops and see if they can do it first. So I'd guess within 4 or 5 years, I'd guess in America, and my money would go on the fact that since corn has become very successful, this would too.
Professor Brian Ford, thank you.